Welcome to this deep dive. You guys sent in a ton of stuff about people history remember for all the wrong reasons.
Yeah.
Dictators, war criminals, even some modern day villains, like
Yeah.
the whole Elizabeth Holmes thing. It's heavy stuff, but I
Yeah.
think I think there's a lot to uncover here.
Yeah, definitely. And it's interesting how your sources include like
Yeah.
the big names like Hitler and Stalin, but then figures who aren't as well known but did equally horrific acts.
Right.
It really shows that evil is not just limited to
Yeah.
one place or time.
Exactly. And one thing that jumped out at me was that none of the sources actually define infamy.
Yeah.
They just give example after example. It's like
Yeah.
they assume we all just kind of know it when we see it.
That's true, but by looking at who they focus on,
Mm-hmm.
we can sort of start to
Okay.
put together what makes someone infamous.
Okay, so let's unpack that. What makes someone infamous?
Well, one thing your sources consistently emphasize
Yeah.
is the scale of the crimes. The higher the body count, the more likely they are to be
Oh.
remembered for their evil deeds.
I see.
Hitler, Stalin,
Yeah.
millions of victims.
Right.
Those are obvious examples, but even then, it's not just about the numbers.
Right, because someone like Idi Amin, he's considered infamous, but
Right.
his regime's death toll, while still horrific,
Yeah.
pales in comparison to the scale of Hitler or Stalin.
Precisely. And that brings us to another factor your sources highlight, impact on society
Yeah.
and history.
Okay.
Hitler in World War II, a textbook example. His actions didn't just cause suffering. They reshaped the entire
Yeah.
geopolitical landscape.
So it's not just about like how many people were harmed, but also how deeply their actions affected the world. It's about leaving an undeniable mark, even if it's horrific.
And then there's the whole aspect of storytelling and legacy.
Yeah.
Vlad the Impaler, his cruelty has become legendary. He's almost more myth than man now.
That's so fascinating. It's like infamy becomes a story that we tell ourselves, whether it's completely accurate or not. It
Yeah.
almost takes on a life of its own. But what about figures like Putin or Elizabeth Holmes? They've gained notoriety incredibly quickly, which feels very different from how infamy worked in the past.
That's a great observation, and it highlights a key difference in our modern world, like 24/7 news cycle,
Yeah.
social media.
Yeah.
It acts like an accelerant Holmes and her corporate fraud. It's
Yeah.
a perfect example. It wasn't just
Yeah.
the crime itself, but it was the way the media dissected every detail, every twist and turn.
It's like we're obsessed with these rises and falls from grace, and
Yeah.
social media just fuels that fire. It's almost like a form of entertainment,
Absolutely.
which is
Yeah.
kind of disturbing.
It raises questions about what this constant exposure to infamy, especially when it's presented in such a digestible, like sensationalized way.
Yeah.
What does that do to our
Yeah.
collective psyche?
Yeah, it's a lot to think about, and it makes me wonder, do we risk becoming desensitized to evil when it's constantly in our faces? But before we go too far down that rabbit hole, let's come back to your sources. They cover a whole range of infamy,
Yes.
political leaders, war criminals, serial killers, even those corporate figures we just talked about.
Yes, and by looking at this diverse group,
Ooh.
I think we can start to see some patterns in how evil manifests throughout history. And nowhere is that more apparent than in the periods your sources list as the darkest in human
Oh,
history.
buckle up, everyone. This is where it gets really heavy.
Indeed, the scale of human suffering
Yeah.
during these periods is almost beyond comprehension.
Let's start with something that's likely familiar. To many people, the Holocaust,
Mhm.
6 million Jews systematically murdered by the Nazis. It's hard to even grasp the magnitude of that
It's
horror.
often cited as the ultimate example of genocide, and for good reason.
Yeah.
What's particularly chilling is the systematic nature of the killings, the meticulous planning, and
Yeah.
the cold, bureaucratic
Mm-hmm.
efficiency
Yeah.
that the Nazis brought to their
Yeah.
extermination campaign.
It's that dehumanization.
Right.
The way they stripped their victims of their humanity is something we see repeated throughout history. But the Holocaust wasn't the only large-scale atrocity fueled by racial hatred. We have the
Right.
transatlantic slave trade, which spans centuries, involved the enslavement of millions of Africans. It's a longer-term horror. But the impact is
Still deeply felt today.
absolutely the legacy of slavery continues to shape social and economic inequalities worldwide. It's a stark reminder that the consequences
Yeah.
of these dark periods reach far beyond the events themselves.
Yeah. And here's one that I think deserves more attention, especially given its sheer scale. The Great Leap Forward in China, Mao Zedong's policies, led to a man-made famine that killed tens of millions. It's a tragedy that's often overshadowed by other events, but the numbers truly staggering. And what makes the Great Leap Forward so disturbing is that it was born out of a utopian vision. Mao genuinely believed that he was creating a better society, but his policies, coupled with his unwillingness to admit failure, led to one of the deadliest famines in human history.
It's a chilling example of how ideology, even when well-intentioned, can have devastating consequences when combined with unchecked power and a disregard for human life.
And that disregard for human life is something we see again and again in these darkest periods. Take the Cambodian genocide. Orchestrated by Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge, they targeted intellectuals and anyone perceived as a threat to their agrarian utopia, leading to the deaths of an estimated 2 million people.
The speed with which they dismantled Cambodian society and turned neighbor against neighbor is truly terrifying. It shows how quickly a nation can descend into barbarity.
And speaking of terrifying speed, the Rwandan genocide stands out for its sheer brutality compressed into just 100 days. 800,000 people slaughtered, largely fueled by ethnic hatred between the Hutus and the Tutsis.
It's a horrific reminder of how quickly prejudice and political manipulation can be weaponized to deadly effect. And it raises questions about the international community's responsibility to intervene.
Absolutely. The Rwandan genocide stands as a stark reminder of the human cost of inaction and indifference.
And finally, we have to talk about Stalin's Great Purge, a period of intense paranoia and political violence. In the Soviet Union, somewhere between 600,000 and 1.2 million people perished, victims of Stalin's ruthless quest to consolidate his power.
It's a chilling reminder that Stalin's reign of terror extended far beyond the famines caused by his agricultural policies. He systematically eliminated anyone he perceived as a threat, creating a climate of fear that permeated every aspect of Soviet society.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground here. It's all incredibly heavy stuff. But looking at these different darkest periods, do you see any patterns emerging? What can we learn from these horrific chapters of human history?
Absolutely. Your sources don't offer any simple explanations, but they do give us a lot of examples. And when you look at these individuals who were behind these atrocities, certain trends become clear.
Okay, I'm all ears. What kind of trends are we talking about?
Well, one of the most consistent patterns is the abuse of power. Almost every single one of these figures held positions of authority that they exploited for their own twisted ends.
That makes sense. We're talking about dictators, political leaders, military commanders, people who had the power to decide who lived and who died.
Exactly. And the examples are everywhere. Hitler, Stalin, Pol Pot, Idi Amin. Power seems to have this corrupting influence. That's a classic tale, really.
Just like that saying, absolute power corrupts absolutely. But it's not just about individuals, right? Your sources also point to the role of ideology, how it can be used to justify these horrific acts.
That's a powerful point, whether it's Nazism, Stalinism, Khmer Rouge's vision of an agrarian utopia, or extremist interpretations of religion. Twisted beliefs can be incredibly dangerous, especially when they're used to dehumanize entire groups of people.
And it's not just abstract ideologies either. Your sources also show how these figures exploited existing social divisions to achieve their goals.
The Rwandan genocide, with its exploitation of ethnic tensions between Hutus and Tutsis, is a prime example. But we see this pattern throughout history. Stalin, for example, he created this category of enemies of the people, which became a catch-all term to justify purging anyone who opposed him.
That's that classic, divide and conquer strategy, right? You create an enemy, make people fear them, and then use that fear to consolidate your power. Another thing that comes up a lot in your sources is this idea of a lack of accountability.
That's crucial. When people in power aren't held responsible for their actions, it creates a breeding ground for evil to flourish. Saddam Hussein and Putin come to mind. Their regimes have been marked by human rights abuses and the silencing of dissent, often with little to no consequence from the international community.
So we've got abuse of power, ideological extremism, exploiting social divisions, lack of accountability as some of the key factors.
Those are some of the big takeaways, yes.
Yeah, the rise of evil.
But there's another factor that your sources sort of hint at, though they don't explicitly link it, to the rise of evil, economic disparity.
Oh, you mean like Does economic hardship or inequality make people more susceptible to these extremist ideologies, or more likely to tolerate a dictator who promises stability even at a horrific cost?
That's the question, and it's a complex one.
Yeah.
Your sources don't offer a definitive answer, but they give plenty of historical example that suggest a connection. Think about the rise of Nazism in Germany after World War I. The country was in economic ruin. People were desperate, and Hitler offered a scapegoat and a promise of a better future.
Yeah, it's a chilling reminder that economic desperation can create fertile ground for extremist ideologies to take root. It's something for all of us to consider, especially in times of economic uncertainty.
It's also important to remember that these factors don't exist in isolation. They often intertwine and reinforce each other.
Give me an example.
For instance, a dictator might exploit existing social divisions to gain power, to use that power, to further entrench economic inequality, which in turn can fuel more resentment and division. It becomes a vicious cycle.
Okay, so we've looked at some of the individual factors that contribute to the rise of evil, but your sources also touch on how societal structures play a role in creating environments where these atrocities can happen. Let's dive into that a bit.
One recurring theme is the role of political systems. Totalitarian regimes, like many of the ones we've been talking about, are often breeding grounds for atrocity.
Because they concentrate power in the hands of a single leader or
a small elite.
Right. There's no room for dissent or opposition.
Think about Nazi Germany, Stalinist Russia, or Pol Pot's Cambodia. These regimes systematically silenced anyone who dared to challenge their authority, making it easier for them to carry out their horrific agendas.
Another point your sources bring up is the power of propaganda. It can be used to dehumanize entire groups of people, making it easier to justify violence against them.
The Nazis are the most obvious example here. Their propaganda machine relentlessly portrayed Jews as a threat to German society, paving the way for the Holocaust. But Stalin and other dictators also used propaganda to demonize their enemies and consolidate their control.
It's a chilling reminder of how easily we can be manipulated, right? How propaganda can warp our perceptions and make us complicit in horrific acts.
And then there's the obvious point that war and conflict create environments where brutality becomes more commonplace. It's almost like social norms break down and the unthinkable becomes possible.
You see this with figures like Pol Pot and Saddam Hussein. Their rise to power and their willingness to commit atrocities were directly linked to periods of intense conflict. War can create a sense of, chaos and impunity that allows evil to take root and spread.
We've talked about totalitarian regimes, propaganda,
and war.
Is there anything else your sources suggest about how societal structures...
Well, as we discussed earlier, there's that potential link between economic inequality and violence.
Yeah, so again, it's this idea that when people are struggling economically, they might be more likely to support extreme ideologies or tolerate a leader who promises to restore order, even through brutal means.
Precisely. It's a complex issue, and your sources don't offer any easy answers. But it's certainly something worth thinking about as you explore the relationship between societal structures and these horrific acts.
This deep dive is already so thought-provoking, and we've only just scratched the surface. Now, before we go any further, I want to take a closer look at some of these infamous figures.
Starting with the two giants of 20th century, totalitarianism. Hitler and Stalin, your sources. Provide some great material for this. What are the key similarities and differences between these two?
Well, as we've already touched on, both Hitler and Stalin were responsible for the deaths of millions. They were both driven by ideologies that they used to justify their actions. And they both used the power of the state to carry out their agendas.
So in terms of scale and impact, they're both in a league of their own. But what about the specifics of their crimes? How do those compare?
One key difference is the nature of their victims. Hitler's regime primarily targeted Jews, as well as other groups deemed racially or ideologically inferior, like Roma, disabled people, and homosexuals. The Holocaust was a systematic attempt to eliminate entire populations based on these twisted racial theories.
Stalin, on the other hand, was more focused on eliminating perceived political threats, right?
Exactly. While he certainly targeted specific ethnic groups, his primary victims were those he saw as a threat to his power. This included political opponents, intellectuals, and anyone suspected of disloyalty.
So different motivations, but both resulting in mass murder. On a horrifying scale. What about the methods they used? How do those compare?
There, too, I see some important distinctions. Oh. The Nazi regime employed systematic methods of mass murder, such as gas chambers and firing squads. To carry out the Holocaust, their goal was efficient extermination.
Whereas Stalin's regime relied more on things like forced labor, famine, and purges.
Correct. The Gulag system of forced labor camps was a key instrument of Stalin's terror, as were the deliberate famines caused by his agricultural policies. While Stalin certainly ordered executions, his methods were often more indirect, aimed at breaking people through suffering and deprivation.
It's a chilling thought that there are different ways to orchestrate mass suffering. And it's not about ranking evil, but understanding the specific ways in which these regimes carried out their crimes.
And there's one final point of comparison that's worth mentioning. The role of war.
Okay.
Hitler's crimes are directly linked to World War II. The invasion of other countries and the war effort itself contributed to the scale and intensity of the Holocaust and other atrocities.
Stalin, on the other hand, primarily committed his crimes domestically, within the borders of the Soviet Union. Though his regime did engage in conflicts like the Soviet-Finnish War, the core of his terror was directed inward at his own people.
Yes, and that distinction speaks to the different nature of their regimes. Hitler's ambitions were expansionist. He sought to conquer and dominate. Stalin, on the other hand, was more focused on consolidating his power within the Soviet Union, eliminating any perceived threat to his rule.
So even though they share some similarities, Hitler and Stalin were ultimately very different kinds of villains, with different motivations and methods, but both left a legacy of unimaginable suffering.
Their names will forever be synonymous with the darkest chapters of the 20th century.
Now, I know you love digging into the lesser-known corners of history. Your sources have some fascinating examples of villains who aren't household names. Can you tell us about a few that really stand out?
Absolutely, there are some. Truly chilling figures who deserve to be more widely known for their crimes.
Give us the highlights.
Let's start with Idi Amin, the dictator of Uganda from 1971 to 1979. His regime was characterized by ethnic persecution, extrajudicial killings, and the expulsion of Asian minorities.
So another example of a dictator exploiting existing social divisions to consolidate his power and eliminate his opponents.
Exactly. And the estimated death toll under Amin's rule is somewhere between 100,000 and 500,000 people. Staggering number. And yet his name doesn't carry the same weight as some of the other figures we've discussed.
It's like there's a hierarchy of infamy. And some figures, despite the horrific crimes, get lost in the shadows of history.
That's an interesting point. And it speaks to how we construct narratives of history. How some figures become symbols of evil, while others fade into obscurity.
It makes you wonder what factors determine who we remember and who we forget. But let's bring back another figure from your sources, someone who committed crimes of a truly horrific nature. Shiro Ishii, the Japanese army, medical officer who led Unit 731 during World War II.
Ishii's crimes are truly stomach-turning. He oversaw a unit that conducted lethal human experimentation on prisoners of war. We're talking vivisections, deliberate exposure to diseases, weapons testing, all under the guise of scientific research.
It's hard to believe. Such barbarity could be carried out. In the name of science, it's a dark stain on human history. And yet, I have to admit, I wasn't familiar with Ishii's story before reading your sources.
And that's precisely why it's so important to dig deeper. To uncover these lesser-known stories, it expands our understanding of the different forms that evil can take and reminds us that darkness can lurk in unexpected places.
Okay, let's move from the battlefield to a different arena, the world of pharmaceuticals. One of your sources highlights the case of Robert Courtney, a pharmacist, who was convicted of diluting chemotherapy drugs for profit.
Courtney's actions are a betrayal of trust on a monumental scale. Thousands of patients may have been affected by his scheme, their chances of survival diminished by his greed.
It's a chilling reminder that evil can be found in seemingly ordinary places, wearing a friendly face and motivated by something as banal as money. And Courtney is not alone. We have John Kapoor, the founder of Insys Therapeutics, was convicted of bribing doctors to prescribe addictive opioids and defrauding insurance companies. His case is a perfect example of how corporate greed can lead to widespread suffering.
It's a reminder that we need to be vigilant, not just against the obvious threats, but against the more insidious forms of evil that can operate within systems designed to help people.
Yeah, these lesser-known villains highlight the different faces of evil. In the 21st century, it's not just about dictators and warmongers anymore. It's about corporate greed, corruption, the abuse of power in all its forms, speaking of modern villains. Your sources include several figures who are shaping our world today. Who stands out to you as particularly relevant?
There are several who have captured global attention. For their actions and the threats they pose, let's start with Vladimir Putin, the current president of Russia.
Putin has certainly become a focal point of global condemnation, especially since the invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Your sources highlight his suppression of political opposition, alleged human rights violations, and efforts to undermine democratic processes. Around the world,
His actions raise serious concerns about the future. Democracy and international security. The invasion of Ukraine, in particular, has been widely condemned as a violation of international law and a blatant act of...
It's a stark reminder that the threat of authoritarianism is still very much alive in the 21st century. And Putin's not the only one. Another figure who looms large in the modern world is Kim Jong-un, the supreme leader of North Korea.
Kim Jong-un presides over one of the most repressive regimes on Earth. Human rights abuses, a cult of personality, and a relentless pursuit of nuclear weapons. His regime's actions pose a constant threat to regional stability
and global security.
Situation that feels frozen in time, a relic of the Cold War, yet the threat is very real and very present. And then for something completely different, we have Elizabeth Holmes, whose story is a cautionary tale about ambition, greed, and the dangers of Silicon Valley. Fake it till you make it.
Holmes' conviction for massive corporate fraud demonstrates that even in the world of tech innovation, ethical boundaries can be crossed with devastating consequences. Her deception of investors and fabrication of medical technology claims have had a ripple effect throughout the biotech industry, eroding trust and raising questions about accountability. In the tech world, these modern villains are all fascinating case studies in the different ways evil can manifest in the 21st century. It's not just about dictators and warmongers anymore. It's about corporate greed, corruption, the abuse of power in all its forms. Now, there's one figure from your sources that I want to dig into a bit deeper because he represents a different kind of evil, one that's more personal, more visceral. Pedro Lopez, the monster of the Andes.
Lopez's case is particularly disturbing, even within the context of serial killers. Your sources say he's believed to have murdered over 300 young girls across South America.
That believed is chilling. It suggests that the true extent of his crimes may never be known.
Exactly, as is. The fact that he specifically targeted young girls adds another layer of horror to his crimes. It speaks to a deep-seated depravity. That's difficult to comprehend.
Comparing Lopez to someone like Hitler raises some interesting questions about how we define evil. On one hand, you have a dictator who orchestrated the deaths of millions, and on the other, you have a serial killer who preyed on vulnerable individuals.
It's a thought-provoking comparison. Both represent extremes of human cruelty, but their motivations and methods are vastly different. Hitler's crimes were driven by a twisted ideology and a lust for power, while Lopez's seemed to stem from a more personal, pathological darkness.
It makes you wonder if there are different categories of evil or if it's all just a matter of scale.
That's a question that philosophers and theologians have grappled with. For centuries, your sources don't offer a definitive answer, but they do provide this rich tapestry of examples that allow us to explore the complexities of evil in all its forms.
Okay, before we wrap up this deep dive, I want to touch on something that's been on my mind throughout this entire conversation. The question of individual versus systemic evil we focus a lot on. The actions of individuals, but
what about the evil that's baked into the systems we live in?
That's an absolutely crucial point. Your sources don't explicitly address this question, but they do provide a lot of material
we can use
to think about it.
Like what? Give me an example. Well, think about the transatlantic slave trade.
Yeah.
Yes, there were individuals who participated in and profited from that horrific system, but it was ultimately made possible by
a complex web of economic, political, and social structures.
You're saying it was a system of oppression that transcended individual actors.
Exactly. And the same could be said for many of the other atrocities we've discussed, the Holocaust, Stalin's purges, the Rwandan genocide. These events were fueled by hatred and prejudice, yes, but they were. Also made possible by institutions, ideologies, and power structures that created fertile ground for evil to flourish.
So when we're talking about evil, it's not always as simple as pointing the finger at a single individual.
Right.
We have to consider the systems that enable and perpetuate these acts.
And that raises important questions about accountability, host-speaker. And that raises important questions about accountability.
Right.
If a system is responsible for evil, how do we hold it accountable?
Right.
How do we dismantle or reform those structures to prevent future atrocities? Those are tough questions. And I don't think your sources provide any easy answers, but they do give us a framework for thinking about the systemic nature of evil.
And that's a crucial starting point.
Okay.
By recognizing the role of systems, we can start to have more nuanced conversations about responsibility, justice, and the prevention of future harm.
Okay, I want to bring this back to you, the listener. Why should you care about all of this? It's heavy stuff, right? Depressing, even.
It's true. These are difficult topics to confront. But understanding the patterns of evil, both individual and systemic, is crucial for several reasons.
Like what? Make it personal for our listener.
Well, for one, it can help us be more vigilant in our own lives by recognizing the warning signs of abuse of power, manipulation, and prejudice. We can be more proactive in challenging those forces.
So it's about empowering individuals to resist evil in their own spheres of influence.
Exactly. And on a larger scale, understanding the historical context of these atrocities can help us make more informed decisions about the leaders we choose, the policies we support, and the kind of world we want to create.
So it's about learning from the mistakes of the past to prevent them from happening again.
Precisely. We have a responsibility to remember these events, not to dwell in the darkness, but to illuminate the path toward a more just and humane future.
That's powerful. Now, before we wrap up this deep dive, I have one final thought to share. Something that your sources made me think about, but didn't directly address. We've talked a lot about the factors that contribute to evil, but what about the opposite? What are the forces that counteract evil, that promote goodness and resilience in the face of adversity?
That's a fascinating question. And it's one that deserves its own deep dive.
Yeah.
But I think we can offer a few preliminary thoughts based on what we've learned from your sources.
Let's hear them.
Well, one thing that stands out is the importance of empathy and compassion. Many of the atrocities we've discussed were made possible by the dehumanization of the victims. So cultivating empathy, the ability to understand and share the feelings of others, is essential for resisting evil.
It's about seeing the humanity in everyone, even those we disagree with or
fear.
Exactly.
Okay.
Along with empathy. I think courage is essential. It takes courage to stand up to power, to speak out against injustice, and to defend the vulnerable. We've seen countless examples throughout history of individuals who risk their lives to oppose evil, often at great personal cost.
Yeah, those acts of courage, even small ones, can have a ripple effect, inspiring others to resist and creating a force for good that can ultimately overcome even the darkest of times.
And finally, I think hope is crucial. Even in the face of unimaginable suffering, the human spirit has this incredible capacity for resilience and the belief in a better future. Without hope, it's easy to succumb to despair and apathy, which can make us more vulnerable to the forces of evil.
So empathy, courage, and hope, those are the antidotes to the darkness we've been exploring. It's a reminder that even though evil exists in the world, so too does the potential for it. And it's up to each of us to cultivate those qualities, to be a force for light in the face of darkness.
This deep dive has been a journey, to say the least. We've delved into the depths of human cruelty, but we've also glimpsed the resilience of the human spirit. It's a lot to process, I know.
It's true, but I hope this exploration has left you with a deeper understanding of the complexities of evil, both individual and systemic, and a renewed commitment to fighting for a more just and compassionate world.
Knowledge is power, as they say, and I feel like we've given you, the listener, a whole arsenal of knowledge today. Use it wisely.
And remember, the conversation doesn't end here. Keep questioning, keep learning, and keep striving to be a good force for good in the world.
That's a perfect note to end on. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep those brains working.